So, one night, 3 actors, 5 books. Our hope is to mimic what happened in Nehemiah 8 and 9, where God's word was read aloud for a long period of time, and the effect of that on God's people was amazing. So we're going to do that together with the books that we've memorized, and we just wanted to let you in on a little conversation that we're going to have about our books. What do you need to know about these 5 books before you arrive on Friday? So we're going to move at a pretty good clip.
Sure.
Through a lot of different information about our books and just help you, so enjoy the ride.
I think the first thing they'd want to know, who wrote our books?
I don't know.
I don't know.
I know one of mine.
Oh, I do know one of mine as well.
Okay, so Ruth.
So Ruth, we don't know who wrote the book of Ruth. Most likely a man, I think 50 years after the fact is kind of what the guess is. For the book of Colossians that I'm also memorizing and performing, we know Paul wrote the book of Colossians.
And the book of Esther we don't know, except we do know they had intricate details of the palace of the king.
Oh.
Very much significant. If you listen to the book, little things that happen all throughout, only someone who was in the palace would know that's how it was done.
So it had to have been relatively soon after the fact.
Yes, and some believe it might have been Mordecai himself, but it's unknown who wrote the
That's
book.
fascinating.
For my 2, I'm going to be doing 2 Timothy. That's a letter by Paul. Hebrews is one where they don't know. Some people say Paul. I've read a really interesting article and talked with a scholar who thinks it might be Barnabas because of its encouragement theme, but no one really knows.
Very interesting.
So those are the 5. And who wrote them?
So what are some of the things that we need to know, or the people that are coming to see this need to know in order to fully understand what our book is about?
Well, I want to start with Esther. It's a book unlike any other in the Bible in that it opens with a lavish banquet given by a king for 6 months, 180
I wanna go
days.
there. Can I enjoy
And
that?
then he's giving a banquet for a week in the palace. So it's for his army officers and the princes of all the provinces. Historically, what we know is that King Ahasuerus wanted to prove he could do what his father Darius could not do, and that's conquer the Greek peninsula. So he's going to give this banquet to show he's powerful and he's wealthy. And then he calls for his wife to come, and she doesn't come. How humiliating. He wants to go to war, and
Awkward.
even his wife doesn't obey. Thus begins the story of Esther. And it covers between the 3rd year of the reign of Ahasuerus, all the way to the 12th year, nearly 9 years. 7 of those, Esther is queen.
I did not know that.
Awesome.
That's fascinating.
Enough time to display her character and to be trusted.
So historically, something big, as far as the book of Ruth, that is on a much smaller everyday scale. This is during the time of the judges when Naomi and her family, they moved down to Moab because there's a famine in the land. And they've got to survive. And so they actually move away from Bethlehem for 12 years, and they're gone until God starts to provide for his people, and Naomi ends up coming back. So grand scale, very everyday, ordinary, troublesome time. Not unlike what's happening now, kind of.
Yeah, that's a really cool comparison that if we hadn't talked about it out loud right now, I wouldn't have thought of. You've got the grandness of God working through this powerful woman, Esther, as a queen, and then in some ways just someone mundane life coming to know this covenant God, living it out through famine, through how do we figure out how life's going to work without our husbands and what's going on.
Exactly. What about with you?
So I'll start with 2 Timothy. What do we need to know about 2 Timothy? Paul's writing from prison. Paul and Timothy have this fascinating relationship to me where they're both pastors, and Paul discipled Timothy and treats him like a son, like my child, Timothy, he says. So the book itself is very relational. So I love to tell people that so that we don't read it or hear it churchy. Like it is the Bible. It is good in that way. But what I mean is if you'll take the moment to go, this is a guy who's in prison who loves this guy. You can literally start feeling, even if you're not an emotional person, you can start feeling Paul's words from prison how much he loves Timothy. Like there's this one moment where Paul says something as simple as, do your best to come to me before winter.
Ooh.
Like you can hear in that, make it sooner than then. So it's highly relational, and it's all about Paul just pouring into Timothy.
That's really interesting because if your book is Paul writing to an individual, Colossians is Paul writing with Timothy to a group of people in the city of Colossae. So that it's a very interesting comparison. Paul is also in prison during this time, so he's also in chains, but very different dynamic there. So to an individual and then to a group of people.
And what I really like about it is that we think of Paul as this big, tough guy, sometimes even harsh, we call
absolutely.
him. And then suddenly we see his heart. We get to see the heart of him.
Well, and you'll hear his heart with how many times he talks to Timothy about a guy named Onesiphorus, and how many times he tells Timothy, come. Which, again, if you're in prison, you have to have someone in that day help you live. Which is why, as you hear these pleas, come to me, I need food. I need, at one point he says, don't forget to bring that cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas. Why? Because no one's going to care and help him stay warm in a prison. So what else is going on in the letter to Colossians, Kareen? What do they need to know about that?
So during this time, and I'm still relatively new with this book. This is a book that I am currently in the process of memorizing. I've been sitting with the book of Ruth for 6 years now, something like that. And I know that you've been with Esther for a long time in Hebrews and even Timothy. So for me, Colossians is relatively new. But everything
Brand new, actually, for this event.
Wow.
But from everything that I am learning as I study this book and read it and commit it to memory, during this time, the Christians in the Roman culture, so the Gentile Christians in the Roman culture, are getting a lot of outside influences like, yes, Jesus, but also don't forget about this. And this other God from little g God from the Roman Empire, and then the Jews actually want you to be circumcised, and all these different things that the Gentiles think, okay, well, I need all of it, and Jesus, and Paul's saying, oh, no. And the interesting thing is that Paul has never met these people.
I love that.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So it's actually, this church was started by this man named Epaphras, and Paul knows Epaphras. Like, Paul trained Epaphras, sent him out, and Epaphras started this church in Colossae. And so they, of course, know Paul. He would be like the mega church pastor kind of thing. You know, everybody knows who Paul is kind of thing. And Paul's writing to them going, no. Go back to Jesus. It's all about Jesus. And there's even a little poem in the first chapter where it's talking about this is who Jesus is. He is this, and he is this, and he is this, and this is how we have salvation, is through him and by him, and all these things are flow from him, and it's very interesting.
Which that literally in this moment, I think what makes me really excited about that is the idea of God's people having pressures coming at them from all different types of culture, and both secular and Christian culture.
Yes.
Right.
We're in the middle of that right now.
Right.
So to have you come in and kind of trumpet Jesus, everybody,
Right.
still same message,
Absolutely.
I think could be really powerful.
It's so applicable here in 2020. One of the verses literally is, I write this that no one may delude you with plausible arguments. So these arguments that the church in Colossae are getting are plausible. Like, Paul is acknowledging that. That's today. I mean, how many different voices are we hearing that are saying, this is actually possible, or think about this, consider this, and sometimes we as believers go, oh, maybe we should consider it, when God's word says, no, Jesus alone.
If Colossians says Jesus alone, Hebrews would say Jesus is better.
I love that.
Like of all, in a way, it deals with some of the same arguments of these things, theological beliefs, cultural beliefs, and in each instance, you keep hearing this, Jesus is better than that. So if you listen to the book as a whole, Jesus is a better priest, he's a better sacrifice, he's better than Moses, on and on and on. He's a better lamb, he's a better covenant. So when it comes to Hebrews, I think some of the things that you have to know is it is among one or two books that quote the Old Testament more than any other book.
Fascinating.
Like, you almost really don't go a chapter in the book without the Old Testament. It is everywhere. So the author, whoever they are, very familiar with the Old Testament. And then to this day, and I've read, I don't know how many commentaries on Hebrews, articles on Hebrews, sermons on Hebrews. To Peter Hubbard's credit and to honor him, I don't think anybody has come up with a better summary of the book of Hebrews than Hubbard, which is keep at it.
He's
worth
it. I remember that.
did
Yeah,
too.
I mean, that's
I've
been,
never forgotten it.
it's
Years.
been,
Yeah.
I think I'm at 15 years
Probably.
since we did it.
It's amazing.
So those two things, and they always go together. Keep at it. Hebrews is a letter of endurance, and it's everywhere. Guys, don't give up. Hold on to your faith. Hold on. Endure. You have need of endurance so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. Keep at it. Why? He's worth it, or Jesus is worth it. And that's all of those better than statements. Why is he worth it? And Paul goes in, kind of explains the difference between how the Israelite culture would view being right with God and Jesus. Well, why is he better? Well, he only had to die once, not lamb after lamb after lamb after lamb, as one example. So I think that's an interesting through line that people could get from Colossians, your book, to my book, Hebrews, of they're both Jesus-centric and give a lot of, in your words, Corinne, I thought was so helpful, it's so applicable today.
Oh,
Keep at it, everybody.
Right.
Is there in our kind of COVID world, racial tension world, all of this stuff going on, the church needs to hang in there.
Absolutely.
And the message of Esther really flows well
I love that.
because God's name is not mentioned, which has been criticized throughout the years, historical years. And yet here we have a people at the moment they are most in crisis. What do but fast for 3 days, night and day, Esther says. Before she actually goes to do her brave, courageous thing, they literally stopped and acknowledged God, a pattern that had been in their culture and in their lives, even though they're dispersed now.
Right.
Even though they're distance worshiping, as you mentioned, even though they're doing that, that's what they clung to, was to do that. That to me is such a lesson to me of stop and pause, meditate on God when things are really in crisis.
Yeah, and the
Meditate on
crisis
him.
there in Esther is so radical. I mean, they are in exile in a different country,
Yes.
ruled by other
Yes.
people, and yet one of those captured people rises to an incredible position of
An
power.
incredible position.
There's even some political overtones in that. I mean,
Oh, yes,
that's where we
right.
are today.
Absolutely. And some people want to portray Esther as this great feminist, like she's powerful and she marches into the king. He already disposed of one queen.
Right.
He would think nothing of another queen embarrassing him, that he would get rid of her. So the very fact that her humility, and if you think about fasting and praying for 3 days with no food, and then you're going to go see a king, she was not in a very physical, powerful position. Her body was weak.
Right.
3 days.
Oh, I'd be dying.
And she goes to do this thing.
We need to go back
So-
to his feast that he had at the very
Yeah,
beginning.
yeah, 3 days, nights.
Let's
It's
go back to
over.
the 6-month feast
Yes,
and enjoy,
yes.
enjoy that.
Yes.
So if you were asked about God's name not being in the book, how would you reply about God being in the book?
Oh, that's excellent. It is that he is continually working in the affairs of men, continually working in a king who can't sleep in the night, while at the same time somebody's plotting evil, and the king decides to do something, and he decides to do something about the very same person. That God is working, laying on the heart of the king to do something kind here. So it's almost as if I believe the curtains are open for the reader and those that are watching, and we get to actually see the hand of God moving when the people on stage didn't know what was happening. And all the while, he's bringing glory to his name, honor to his name through a small, tiny little lady who happens to become queen. It's a beautiful story. It's for us. When we think God is silent, he's working. He knows the suffering, he understands, and he will move for his glory and for his name to be known.
I think those words just spark a connecting point, moving from, I mean, we're going to move through, 2 Old Testament books into 3 New Testament books, but we don't have to see them disconnected. Like the theme of suffering
absolutely
No.
not.
is going to be picked up in your
In
book.
Ruth, absolutely.
right.
But I also, the way you described that, Janice, about, parting the curtain and letting everybody see, that's the same thing with Ruth. Because Naomi had no clue what was happening. In the first chapter of Ruth, I don't know, the first 5 verses, 12 years happen. And there's a lot that goes on. And then you just come to a screeching halt, and then you pick up where the story is. And it's like the audience gets to a front row seat to enjoy that and watch how God works.
Yes.
Even though Naomi didn't see that. Same kind of theme there with where is God? One of my favorite moments in the book of Ruth is when I call it an aha moment. You know, that moment where the clouds part and the light from above comes down and the angelic choir goes, oh, or the light bulb goes. It's when Naomi asks Ruth, she says, where were you today? Well, like, what field did you glean in? And she said, well, the field that I gleaned in, the name of the man was Boaz. And in that moment, she goes, I take a second there and kind of go, he has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. I feel like that's a massive aha moment, because the he there refers to not Boaz, but to God. That she recognizes in that moment that God's providence, God's love, his loving loyalty, he cannot not love us, has been with her this whole time, following her, because the living is obviously to her, and the dead is to her husband Elimelech and to her sons Kilion and Mahlon. So very, very interesting there. Same with Esther. Where is God? He seems silent to some of the Old Testament. I don't want to call them believers. Maybe they are. Are they believers? Would you call them believers? Believers. We'll call them believers. But to these men and women who walked with God, and where is God in all this time? And he's been there the whole time.
And I know our heart in performing these books is that our audience would actually stay on every word.
Yes.
Not pretend they know the end. Well, they do know the end because they've read the Bible, but actually stay with us as we let the stories in each one of our books unfold. Like, live with this in the moment. Live with this as it's happening to them, and feel the power of God moving in the affairs of men. That is the powerful thing.
These are real people.
They were, absolutely.
That wrestled through very real emotions and situations that were difficult and in despair. I think of Naomi. One of the things I believe that you really need to know when you're listening to the book of Ruth and reading it, well, there's 2 things in particular that are really out of our cultural context. So the first one is the importance of the male heir, because in that culture, men were everything. They carried on the family name, they carried on the property, and they inherited all the money. If there was no man present, the women were basically thrust into utter, absolute poverty. And couldn't exist. So here, Naomi lost her husband and her 2 sons, and she's, past her prime. She can no longer bear children. And so now she's presented with a problem that can never be solved. There is no way to solve that. And so her despair is so real, her bitterness toward God is so real that she literally changes her name. She's like, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Naomi means pleasantness. Mara means bitterness. Like, don't even call me that anymore. Can you imagine? Like, don't call you Janice or don't call you Ryan. Like, call me what I, am just embodying right now. So very, very interesting there. And in comes the second term, which is called the kinsman redeemer, or in the translation I use, we use the term guardian redeemer. You might hear those 2 terms, and they're basically synonymous with one another, interchangeable. But the idea is that God set up a way that when a man died, that his brother or a close relative could step in and marry the wife, with the goal of hopefully having a son that would then bear the name of the deceased man, or inherit the property, take care of his widow, all these things. And I mean, there was a sacrifice there for the kinsman redeemer, because what if that was their only son that they ever had? Then he loses the ability for somebody to take his property and his money and carry that on. I mean, it was a sacrifice to say, I'm willing to give up what is mine for the sake of my relative. And it's just a picture of what Jesus eventually came and did for us. He came and Boaz redeemed Ruth. And we think of it as a love story. I think it is a love story in part, but it's a bigger love story of what, an illustration of what God then comes to do for us through his death and resurrection. And he bought us back, just like the picture of what Boaz did. Boaz steps in and he's willing to give up, to sacrifice, to redeem Ruth and everything, to carry on that name.
Wow.
So that the name is not forgotten, because as you know, in Esther, probably names are huge, and it really does indicate like who you are as a person. I mean, it's huge. If your name is not carried on, then you are essentially emotionally cut off. Can you imagine being separated from your family, from people you love, because your name isn't carried on anymore? Very interesting.
So our hope is that this small dialogue will bring all of you into these books a little more prepared when you come to hear them on Friday, October 9. We are so excited to let God's word shine. Again, this is all flowing from Nehemiah, where God's word can have amazing impact as we just hear it. So thanks for being willing to join us. We hope this serves you well, and we will see you when we give you all 5 of these books in one night.